Hey folks, Michael here with the CCERP podcast, Cypress Creek Ecological Restoration Project. Today, talking about an aspect of the ecology that's very important and that a lot of us love, the wildlife, particularly we're talking some about the coyote. So, Shelley Alexander was nice enough to join us today to talk about the coyote and other animals. And could you introduce yourself, Shelley?
Sure. I'm Dr. Shelley Alexander, and I'm a professor in geography at the University of Calgary. And right now I am in Cochrane, Alberta, which is west of Calgary, Alberta, and it is in the foothills of Alberta. And I am looking out at the front ranges of the Rocky Mountains. And a little bit beyond the front ranges is a place people probably know, which is Banff, Alberta, about an hour from here.
Wow. Nice. Beautiful. But jealous. Be nice to be looking at. But what's the weather?
You won't be so jealous when you know last week was minus 40.
I was going to ask. Thank you.
So it has some trade-offs.
Yeah. It's like a trade-off I'm not willing to purchase.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so we were just, I don't know about last week, but maybe we had a low of 38 or 40 or something like that. Above zero.
Oh, well, this is Celsius, so minus 40
whoa. That's even, I was going to ask.
Minus 40 Celsius is really cold.
That's even worse. Wow. Dang. So, one thing folks might want to know, so you have a degree in geography, so geography, why are you talking about coyotes?
Right. Yeah, that's a question that pops up regularly, and and partly it's because people don't really know about the full scope of geography. And so I always like to say geography was really the original discipline, right? If you think back to somebody like Darwin, they were actually natural history people, but they were studying animals and people around the world. So how, what animals occur where and what people occur where and how those interact. And so geography is very, very broad. And one of the areas of that is biogeography, which looks at the relationships of plants to animals in space, and also how do people affect where animals live. And then really my degrees, you can work in the area of human geography, but I'm in the area of animal geography. So I teach in the topics of animal geography, which is about human-animal relationships of all forms. And then in my doctoral research and my master's research, I used a lot of geographic information systems to understand where animals needed to live and how they get through the landscape, how human disturbance like developments or roads or trails affect where they move and their success moving across the landscape. And so in my PhD, I did things like figure out where we should place crossing structures across highways in order to allow different wildlife to move back and forth. And so that falls really squarely within, you could do that within biology, but it really took a lot of fieldwork skills for tracking, but also the use of geographic information systems. And geographic information systems really are housed, those are computer mapping systems that use satellite imagery. And those are really housed typically within a geography department. And so I brought the blend of background with field practice with wildlife into geography to use geographic information systems or GIS to do planning and land use management and for conservation purposes. So that's how I end up in geography. And then, of course, my research changed over time, and I started to look specifically at coyotes. But by then, I'm already in the Department of Geography, but I always am looking at the human component of that relationship, more so than just how they're using how coyotes exist. I do that as well, but my work really covers a very broad range of human and physical and animal geography. So that's how I'm there.
And how did you get into being interested in that in geography in the first place? Like, did you run around outdoors when you were young, or like what?
I spent my summers on the farm in Saskatchewan. And so I think I gained an appreciation for animals back then, livestock, and some about wildlife, but mostly livestock and just living living in a prairie ecosystem.
Cool.
But I grew up in the city, and I grew up in a lot of different cities around the world. And so I had exposure, not really a lot of exposure to wildlife. So it wasn't until I got out into my undergrad that I started working as a naturalist in Jasper National Park. And there I became really interested in wildlife and in things like geology as well, and landforms. And then it was really a circuitous route. I ended up volunteering doing wildlife research on wolves with one of the leading wolf researchers in Canada on a new project that had been set up in Banff National Park. And then from there, because I was, had an aptitude for it and a good understanding of what was going on, just intuitively, I moved into that area, and he supported me continuing on.
Cool.
And then I ended up going to grad school. So that's it. It really wasn't a plan to go down that route, but I became very passionate about conservation and about speaking for the voiceless around that time. And so that's really, it was around the 1990s where I just got funneled into that direction.
Cool. And you're also into horses?
Oh, big time. Yeah. Horses, probably I gained my love for horses out on the farm in the summer when I was a kid. So we were living overseas, and then we would come back to Saskatchewan, and I would spend some of my summers riding. And I didn't actually take that up again until I was out of undergrad, and I started riding again and eventually bought my own horse. And so I've been probably 15 years now with my own horse and engaged in all sorts of different equestrian activities.
Cool. What kind of horse?
Well, I've had two different horses. The first one was an Andalusian, and I had him for about 10 years. And then the new horse I have is a Hanoverian quarter horse. So really good quarter horse head, but lots of flashy movement, and I've done lots of different things with the horses over time. But the biggest thing for me is the relationship with the animal, forming that connection and being able to communicate and engage with the animal in a way that's gentle and still you're communicating and able to have it do the things that it will do for you, the various movements and stuff. And I think there's something special about that. That's what draws many people to horses, that they're so big, and yet, you can form this bond and you can learn how to communicate with them, and that they would be willing to engage with you in those activities. It's really a special relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that the way some people deal with them. Unfortunately, just like the way some people would deal with people or with kids, they want to beat them and stuff. And some people, unfortunately, think they should do that with horses. I'm glad there are people out there like, I don't remember all the names right now, but Joe Camp and Monty Roberts and Buck Branahan and many others, Hempfling and a lot of other people in my brain that I can't remember right now that are doing good work on that. Yeah.
Very much so. I mean, I think because they're so big, people perceive that, or early on anyway, and we have a hangover of some of that early training that still permeates it. But they think because they're so big that maybe they don't feel as much, but they can detect fly on their skin, and so and they are such incredibly sensitive animals that they really help you actually become a more sensitive person, and we don't need to be forcing them to do things. We need to ask, and they, as one of my instructors had said, is the human is usually behind the horse. The horse is waiting on the other side of the open door, and you just have to figure out how to prove it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Who are some of the influences in horses? Like, are there some like kind of known horse names, horse people that have influenced you?
I worked not particularly. I worked with a lot of different trainers over time, and some of the people you named there, I haven't, worked with them, but certainly read their works and been influenced by that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's others, of course, I've read and watched their videos, but it just caught me off guard. I didn't prepare for that.
A conversation on horses. Well, you named off a lot of people, so that's pretty good.
Yeah. And then one guy, he's got some stuff I like. He does Aikido, black belt, and he talks about the two fields interacting and learning horses in Aikido and
very much. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, and really it's almost an act of meditation, riding, right? Because you become so connected. If you're doing it properly and compassionately, there's it's a stilling of the body and control of your own body, and so it does. You do enter sort of a flow state or meditative state. Of course, you have to stay focused, but I think many people might describe it like that. When it's clicking and perfect, you're in a state of you're sort of suspended outside of our normal reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like we're doing what we should be doing normally instead.
Yeah. Instead of worrying about a bunch of things that we can't fix.
Yeah. Yeah. And then throw in really quickly, like with the relationship thing you're talking about and how it helps. Yeah, there's, as you're aware, some folks will be aware, some won't, but a lot of like people are using horses for therapy. All kinds of things. Like there's, what is it? A group up northern U.S. Horses for Heroes, or Heroes for Horses, something like that. I forget. I'll put a link in the show notes. But yeah, they use take vets on week or two long trips into the wild or on horseback, and so they got to learn how to deal with the horse in the first place, and that right there helps them. And then being alone with a group, having to take care of the horses and be in the wilderness, that helps the vets recover a lot.
Yeah, and the thinking with respect to that, I actually used the horse myself for that kind of purpose. But the thing behind that is that they resonate with us, and so they don't do really well with people who are masking their emotions. And so when you're in a state of something like PTSD or that, you're often controlling what the outside looks like. But the horses are pretty quick to see through what your internal emotional state is. Yeah. And so for myself, I didn't start riding horses for that purpose, but later on in my riding, the horse became a vehicle for that because I had PTSD. And so, one of the philosophies, one of the thinking, I guess, out there, not philosophies, is that, the horse that you get is the horse that you get is the horse that you need. And, they really pick you versus you pick them. Now, obviously you can look and pick a pretty horse, but, and it's not a good match for you, but, some people believe that the horse that shows up in your life is the one you need. And certainly that's what happened with me. I got a horse that was extremely emotional. And so he would resonate really, really quickly with me. So one of the things that happens with PTSD is you sort of step outside your body, right? And you don't even know you're detaching. And so when you do that and you're riding a horse that's extremely sensitive, it reacts to that because you're no longer connected to it. And so it causes you to have to be more conscious of being aware of when you're shifting in and out of those states, and also learning to calm your body. the reactivity that's sort of hardwired into your limbic system, right? And so they are extremely helpful for that. There's a lot of pushback on it because, and the same with dogs in therapy, because because they are helping but not fixing. There tends to be pushback within the current medical system to fund that or provide funding for that. I think that's changing a little bit. We're getting more and more evidence, but it's a tough one to overcome because, of course, when people want to fund that, like as in something that's insurable as medical coverage, there has to be demonstrated results. And it's really just one tool, right? It's got to be used in combination with other things like therapy. But anyway, highly valuable, and they are having a lot of success with using horses in a variety of different ways for therapy, whether it's handicapped kids and, anyway, it's there's lots, it's horses aren't just about jumping on the back and riding nose to tail on a trail ride. There's so much more to engage with them and so much more they can do for us, right?
Yeah, true. Totally. But interesting. We could have that as a whole podcast in itself, but
yeah, sorry, we're off track now.
Okay, but good talking about that. Interesting information for some folks, and we wanted to talk more about coyotes and wildlife today, but
you bet.
So to turn, this is not a good segue. It feels like a hard break instead of a nice smooth segue from
no. Animals. It's all animals. So just keep moving.
But after that, it's like everyone will need to stop the podcast and cry or whatever, and then come back to it. So let it sink in. Yeah. Go watch some good horse
hopefully it wasn't
stuff.
that upsetting, but anyway.
Yeah, just maybe cry in a relief way and a good way, and not an upsetting way, but when you know what it really does and all that. But so anyway, so the coyotes, another form of wildlife. So, so you got into coyotes by studying wolves first?
Well, yeah, it's kind of weird because wolves were the target, right? I was working on volunteering on the wolf project, and then it's kind of, I call coyotes my accidental species because no matter what I did, every time I was working on another species, coyote kept popping up. And eventually, after about 15 years of that, I was like, maybe I should be studying coyotes because nobody else is really focusing on them in Canada. And so, I had worked in Nova Scotia very early on as a volunteer, working with captive wolves. And of course, then again, that's what I did. I went there to work with the captive wolves, and what do you know, I had 3 little coyote puppies to take care of and to study the development of play in coyotes. And at the time, I don't think I didn't realize the significance of it as much. But play is really foundational in terms of understanding communication in animals. Most mammals play to some degree, but play actually is the development of language, and same with humans, right? So they learn the rules of how to get along, and if you don't play by the rules, of course, you get punished. And so with play in coyotes, it's they're with dogs, they have bite inhibition, and so they don't bite too hard. You can be a dominant animal, subdominant animal. You can be a big or small, but when you play, it's a great equalizer. But when you break the rules, like you bite too hard, or you bite in the wrong place, or you mount, your play partner, the game will stop. And so they learn that if they don't inhibit their bite, this is the same thing with dogs, right? If they learn they don't inhibit their bite at the right time, then the fun stops and the endorphins stop, right? And it's the same with kids. So they're learning in those play scenarios how to socialize. And what it does tell us about animals like coyotes or other social animals is that they do have a moral code of conduct. They know the difference. They have to control how they interact with other animals in order to get along well. And when you have social animals, like, let's say, coyotes can live alone or they can live in packs. And they are a little lower social order than something like wolves. Wolves must, pretty much must live in a pack to survive, because the body size requires them to take down large prey, and the large prey in order to survive, and the large prey that they need to take requires more than one individual. And so to be a wolf, you have to be more forgiving of other people's, other members' transgressions, or control yourself, right? So you have to be more social. Coyotes can live in a much more flexible way, and as such, they have evolved to be a little less social. There's a little more aggression between individuals within, but they still have to. They're still very tightly bonded. They love each other, and they still have to get along when they live in packs, right? And so play is really the precursor to that, where they learn the rules of right and wrong. And that's where we now get into this idea of, if animals play and have these codes of conduct, then they have a moral, they have a morality similar to ours. And therefore, in an animal rights perspective, people would look at that and say, well, then therefore they should have moral considerability. Perhaps not the same as humans, but they should have some form of, a higher level of moral considerability.
Other than like what Descartes thought, where they were just machines.
Yeah.
Or B.F. Skinner, or they weren't conscious, and all this
just
philosophic nonsense.
Response.
Yeah, some people.
Stimulus response.
It goes back, and some people say, Stoics might have said this. I got to look into it. I'm not sure their position, but even way back in the Stoics in ancient Greece, I think some people thought that animals weren't really conscious. And then I don't know if it was then or later in philosophy, but then some of this screwy idea that if you're in pain, it's not real, but it's when you are aware that you're in pain. It's like, that is ludicrous.
Yeah, it goes back to, it's really disturbing time period in human history. But in terms of, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. But didn't apply to animals. It only applied to humans. But then later we started with vivisections, right? Which was based on the same idea. They felt that when they were cutting, vivisection is live cutting, when they would experiment on animals and in the medical realm, right, instead of cutting open people, they would just attribute the noises to simply sounds, not feeling. And so, but you know what? That's not gone. There's a lot of people that still think that way.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So we're still overcoming that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then that's one thing that led to some, like, what amounts to physical abuse of, like, young children, too. They're 2 or 3. They don't know it yet. Like, they're not reflective, so they don't really feel it. So they'll forget. It doesn't really exist. But, it's pretty sad. But, so deer can play too. Coyotes, wolves, deer. A lot of animals have play and teaching as well. It's interesting.
So do all of our domestic animals, and all the ones that we eat also play, right? So it's when you start digging into that, it does change the way you think of it, and you have to come to terms with those kinds of questions. That's the kind of stuff I tackle in my animal geography class, is about these. How do we make the decisions we do about which animals we will eat or not? And so, it is more and more we're recognizing consciousness in so many animals. And it's fantastic, because the bar is starting to move on that. And
what are some books you know of, maybe articles or books for the general layperson that might be interesting in that regard about animal consciousness?
One of the most influential for me was work by, and it's extremely accessible, Mark Bekoff's work on emotional lives of animals is one of the names of the books. He has many, the Animal Manifesto and that, and those are really nice reads. There's also a little bit more, if you get back into Frans de Waal's work on animals, It does go way back to Darwin has a book called Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal, which essentially outlines the fact that we have all the same emotional expressions, or just in terms of consciousness we're all on a spectrum. But I would say, for contemporary stuff that's very accessible and yet still, full of scientific background would be Mark Bekoff's book. And of course, he's also with Project Coyote advisory board, so you can find him that way too. But it'd be easy to just Google those. And that's actually one of the textbooks I used in my class is his book, Emotional Lives of Animals, because it outlines a lot of those foundations for understanding sentience in animals, and lots of examples of different animals and how they express sentience.
Cool. And I'll put some links to some of their books in the show notes for folks, and
Sure.
Then some others I've read, I'm aware of, like I think Carl Safina, if I remember right, he's written some stuff. And this guy, biologist, naturalist, Baron Heinrich, he's done some really good work on
the raven stuff.
yeah.
Very much so. The raven stuff is, gosh, I read that a long time ago, and I loved that his first book on the ravens. Oh yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. He's got a lot of books.
Yeah, thinking about tool use and in animals that we wouldn't traditionally think. And, we're learning more and more about things like raven families pairing with wolf families. And we see a lot of this sort of mutualism that, so for example, coyotes, you often see magpies nearby with them. And I think one of the really interesting things that I find about this is I started reading a lot of the First Nations storyline, and a lot of these relationships are described within those stories about, if you're looking at the coyote stories, for example, what is coyote doing and who is he closely engaged with most of the time. And those things that we now are knowing are mutualist behavior in science. We're proving it with science. We're actually embedded in stories a long time ago. And I love seeing that we've missed that for so many hundreds of years. We've missed it.
Yeah.
That indigenous knowledge is already telling us all of these things. So
yeah, I hear other stories on a similar vein like that about scientists going somewhere and trying to investigate something, and some of the locals have already known it. It's already in their lore and wisdom, and or else they tell the scientists, the local folk tell the scientists something, and they don't believe it, but then eventually they investigate it and find out it was right. Yeah, interesting. But and then Dan Flores has a book, Coyote America.
That's a great his recent book. Coyote America. Yeah, fantastic. So there's lots out there. I didn't have all those stored in my brain. You're right. You're hitting all the key ones there.
Cool. So you were studying wolves, and you started out getting into coyotes by watching them play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And then I came back and I did my master's and my PhD on sort of not on coyote stuff, but coyote kept popping up in all of the work that I did. And then it was really in 2005, I think, that I formalized that. And I had a student who had come in who was interested in working on that. And so we started a project that was really an ecological study about what do coyotes eat and where in urban settings. And is that connected to where they get into more conflict? So the idea there being we know that animals can habituate to human food. And so if we wanted to understand if there was a connection between where they were eating human food and the chances, the encounters that people were having or pets being killed or that. So that was really the first of its kind in Canada, where we were looking at the diet and then also comparing that spatially across the city, where the diet was, if it had more garbage, was there more conflict? And really, there hadn't been an urban coyote diet study done at the time either. So I had a student who came in, and she was just stellar, Victoria, and did the scat collection and analysis. And at the same time, I was working on conflict work from reports on coyotes. So we dovetailed those together. We saw some really cool stuff with respect to the diet. We saw, they're eating the things that they shouldn't be eating, but people were leaving out, uncontrolled garbage and bird seed and dog food. But also there were periods of time where they were eating crab apples. And so they were cleaning up a lot of the fruit, crab apples and other berries from the trees, and the other one being Saskatoon berries, which is a little blue, like a blueberry on a tree that we have here. It's native here. And so those types of things, and some of those, the crab apples, are a fruit-bearing tree that has flowers on it, and people like to plant it in urban areas because it's really pretty in the spring. But what we're finding then is that animals are coming in and eating that, animals that we don't necessarily want to be spending a lot of time around people. And the more time they're doing that, the more likely they're going to get into conflict. They get dependent on that food, and they get protective of that food. And so the crabapple one was pretty cool, and that was just during the fall, mostly after they'd fallen off the trees. But so it was kind of, this is one of those things that coyote do to you that keep you wanting to study coyote. We wrote up a little report for the city about management recommendations, and we suggested that obviously coyotes are cleaning these things up off the ground, and so people should make sure they clean up all the fruit off the ground. And then I also had an online reporting site, a mapping tool that citizens could report coyote sightings to. Through that, they ended up having a lot of public engagement. And people, one day, all of a sudden, somebody sent me a note and said, I think you should take a look at this. And it was a citizen in Calgary had filmed a coyote in their crabapple tree about 15 feet up. It climbed up into the tree, and it was winter, and it was picking the crab apples. It was balanced like a little ballerina. It was balanced like a little ballerina up in the trees and picking the crab apples.
Wow.
And so again, totally, just when we think we figured out using normal tracking and normal scientific methods, that was another example, though, where the eyes of the citizens and the people, the locals on the land, can fill you in on bits and pieces that you might not know are happening. And so that was a valuable shift there. But what it did mean that people actually have to pick the fruit, right, not just pick up off the ground. And so that was a bit eye-opening.
Yeah. Instead of planting crabapple, plant something you actually want to pick.
Well, yeah, pick it. And I mean, people make crabapple jam, but typically they just leave trees. They just leave it to fall to the ground, right? Most people aren't making jam.
Yeah.
But in places like Banff, and in places like Banff, they've actually started actively removing the crab-apples because the bears are coming in and eating them, and then the bears are getting removed from those neighborhoods, right? They're not killed. No. That's enough. They're not killed.
What's the dog's name?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's 3 of them.
Oh, okay.
There's this one here. I don't know if you can see her.
Yeah.
Brenna, what are you doing? There's one over there.
Oh, little
There's one over there. So there's 3 of them. There's Brenna and Clara and Kika. They're quite alert now. Anyway, so the crabapple thing was very interesting, but it's one of those things where, coyote came by the name trickster pretty honestly, because they're always messing with you. They figure things out, and just when you think you've got them pinned down, something else, they squirt out the side and do something else. So
what do you mean they got the name trickster? What are you referring to?
Oh, well, down in coyotes referred to as trickster in southern United States. One of the First Nations or Indigenous names for the coyote was trickster.
Oh, so it was just in part of the U.S.? It wasn't like around the whole U.S.?
Well, I mean, that's where you mostly read it, but I think it's become more common use across North America that people refer to that. They have different names.
But I mean, with the ancient Indians, ancient Native Americans, like.
You know what? I don't know enough about that. But I do know. Coyote featured in a lot of different storyline across North America. So, and is always a bit of a shapeshifter. Is always doing this, playing tricks on people and getting into trouble and kind of the mirror on people in terms of the ways that you get into trouble, but. So Coyote has a lot of different labels, or is recognized as differently in different cultures based on the stories that I've read. So, but I'm definitely not an expert in that. So,
do you recall some of them, or is that like? Would that tax your memory too much? Like it would probably tax our memory too much to try to remember.
Well, it's a bit mixed up, right? Because some of it is from First Nations and then or Aboriginal or Indigenous storyline, and then some gets sort of appropriated into our current, and I'm not really sure where the lines are now, but so we have people call them song dogs, prairie wolves. That's actually an old that's one of the first classifications of them by Jonathan Say, but I'm trying to think. Oh, Audubon. So there's a piece by Audubon that shows Kenneth Latran's prairie dog. And so that also kind of carried along for a while, and people thought there were prairie wolves and coyotes. So there's a misconception there. Their prairie wolf was actually a coyote. I can't think. I can't think exactly, but trickster, song dog. And I think part of the issue there too is that there are names for those animals, but they're lost in translation, right? When we try to, we don't really understand because we're not of the worldview, Indigenous worldview. We don't, and we don't have access to the language. You don't always fully understand, and we don't translate it properly sometimes. So I think it's dangerous to try to venture there when you don't really know that stuff well.
Yeah, and you say the coyote was used like as a mirror for people. Like, why is that?
Well, just in terms of yourself, the inner self, and the ways that you might the bad things that you might do, or the funny things that you might do. The coyote sort of embodies those in a lot of the stories that you read. Maybe bad decision making, and teaching us a lesson about what we might do that's not good.
So coyotes, like Native Americans found coyotes more like people than they found like beaver-like people or hawks-like people or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know that you can extend it that far, but and it's definitely not my area of expertise. But all animals had significance, right? And so each embodied different characteristics and different meaning. Yeah.
But I was wondering, since coyotes and people are both fusion animals, and so whereas some others, deer, aren't. So it seems like there's one of the reasons, or an underlying reason, why some Native Americans could have identified with the coyote and found similarities in behavior and all that.
Yeah, probably. I mean, and it was wolves that jumped across, right, to become domesticated. And so we do have an affinity for canids, and partly because there's, one, we share, the same emotional spectrum. And so we can read and understand each other. But also they're social. And so that, and they're predator. So they're top down, and they have a lot of similarities when they're in family groups to people. So I think that we would, all storyline would recognize that.
How'd you describe like the nature or character of the coyote?
I mean, I think the ingenious, innovative, fun, troublemaker, or maybe I should say easily gets into trouble because incredibly curious, as opposed to being a troublemaker, because it's usually not the coyote that's creating the trouble. But
Sure.
What else? Incredibly smart, adaptive, resilient.
And ecologically, why would they be like that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because one of the papers that I did actually focuses on the use of language to describe. So I've interviewed a lot of landowners and one of the questions I asked them was about the first few words that come to mind about coyote. And then I created a word cloud around that. Cool. So you could see what words came up most frequently. And the words do two things. They describe the nature. So, are they innovative and clever in that? And then they describe the appearance. So are they mangy or are they whatever, beautiful or that? And it's interesting because different people use different groups of people. The agricultural people I interviewed tended to focus more on behavior, and because they watched them all the time, engaged, right, with their livestock and with other animals. And the people in the more rural or urban sort of set described them more based on their appearance as opposed to their role in the ecosystem. And so the question was about their role in the ecosystem, right? Yeah. How do those words relate to their role in the ecosystem? Well, I mean, why are they like that? Part of the thing is coyotes they are one of the only native North American species. So they evolved on the North American continent. And in their current form, Canis latrans, the oldest records go back to about 1 million years ago. Wow. On the North American continent. Prior to that, they looked very similar, but they were just a little bit smaller in size. And so over the millions of years, they became really, we call them generalists, so they can eat whatever they want. They will switch food to whatever they can get, or whatever is most prevalent in the landscape. And so over those million years, they became mechanically really well fit to move through the landscape and also adaptive because of the diet became extremely adaptive. And that's what creates the resilience for them. So resilience is about, regardless of the types of perturbations or background disturbance that's going on in climate or in resource availability, you can rebound. Your population can stay at a good level or rebound quickly. So one of the things that they did to compensate was they developed very plastic or very wide feeding habits. You can see that in the teeth structure as well, right? They have grinding teeth at the back. So they're not exclusively carnivores. They can eat plants and fruit and seeds and grass, whatever. And so when that's evolution conferred that on them, but also adaptive resilience in terms of their breeding capacity. So they have a very narrow window, which is right now in the end of January and February, in which time they are both, the males and females are both fertile. And so that restricts their breeding really to their own kind. So you don't get a lot of watering down of, unless you happen to be in a circumstance where during that little narrow window, a male coyote impregnates a female dog or vice versa. Most of those pups, if they were hybrids, wouldn't survive, but the hybridization does occur. But these are biological mechanisms to keep them more pure. And then also they respond to the environmental conditions in terms of the number of young that they'll have. And so if it's a really rich year, they can have more young and repopulate after a year that maybe is not so good. Where this actually plays out in terms of management is that when we try to eradicate them, so we kill them in large numbers, they actually adaptively respond to that. And many of the social constraints break down. So normally if you have a pack of coyotes, you'd have a sort of a dominant pair that's breeding. And if we disrupt that, the research is showing that we end up dropping the first reproductive age down. So you get like teenagers reproducing. So instead of having a social cap and saying, that keeps only older adults breeding, you get younger adults breeding if you're killing them extensively. And then they also rebound in that they have more young because there are fewer coyotes and more resource. And so really very quickly, they'll just bounce back. The challenge in this, of course, so people will often say, well, no big deal then, you can kill them and they'll just bounce back. The problem is this is a social animal that is transmitting social knowledge through generations. And if you destroy that social fabric, then the animals are not necessarily going to learn the best way to behave. And that's an ultimate consequence of killing, is that the new animals that come up are younger demographic, poorly educated, and then actually tend to depredate or go after livestock or domestic pets more frequently. And so it's kind of creates this vicious circle, right? So it's important to maintain that social fabric and maintain those animals that are doing the right thing. And coyotes aren't just killed just because they're doing the wrong thing. People just go out and kill them all the time.
Yeah.
So the numbers that you're looking at are, it's one coyote per minute is the that people are killing. And so this does have, people sometimes look at this from a numbers perspective and go, well, like they repopulate really quickly, so what's the big deal? But if you were to take that same analog with people, it'd be like, well, there's still an element of we're losing social structure, and is it really fair to be doing this? Is it really humane to be doing this to them? So there's different issues with that. Bottom line being that killing them doesn't solve the problem of coyote conflict. So that would be how those things manifest. From an ecological perspective, changes. They're very, very adaptable then. And of course, that's one of the reasons they get into trouble, is that they can eat garbage. They can live in downtown New York and scavenge, eat rats and whatever. And so that's then not preferable. That's a pretty ghettoized existence. But they can survive there. And then, of course, they get in close contact with people and you end up with conflict.
People getting scared.
People create the conflict, yes.
Yeah. And why do you say people create the conflict?
Well, coyotes are just doing their thing, right? People tend to not know how to react to them, or have left the garbage out in the first place. So generally, there's some underlying human. Coyotes aren't out looking for a fight. They just protect themselves, or they're young, or they protect the food that they're looking after.
Kind of like we do too.
Yeah, same thing we do. Yeah.
Like if someone broke into your house.
Absolutely. Yeah, you would react, protect your young, you'd protect your mate, you'd protect your resources, and you'd probably do that very, if you had the opportunity, quite ferociously, right? And so they are like us that way. I think we lose, it's a great way to put it, because we lose connection with that they are like us. We are all animals, and so that's how they're functioning. They're not motivated by trying to get even with us and do something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, like I tell folks sometimes, it's like, there's a snake, kill it. It's like, it just wants to be left alone. Like, leave it alone. It's like, some people act as if the whole purpose of a snake or a coyote or a wolf is to, like, attack and kill them. But it just wants to live its life, generally. Leave it alone.
Precisely. I would say almost uniformly. That's all they're trying to do, is live their life.
Yeah. But, it seems like there's a similarity, too, in with people. I think we've lost some of that wisdom of dealing with nature, dealing with animals, just as coyotes do. If you kill off the older ones, or try to kill them a lot, and then it's kind of like what is it? Lord of the Flies.
Exactly. Only they're not. Yeah, it's not quite. It's probably worse than Lord of the Flies.
Yeah. But and then part of the coyote behavior, isn't that because they're predators, but not top of the food chain? So they've got they prey on other things, but then they can't be as relaxed as, say, like wolves, who have nothing or little above them, but they've got wolves preying on them, and that's helped their adaptation and kind of affected their nature evolutionarily. And
well, I mean, the historic data would show that wolves and coyotes actually live together well, but they just partition their use of space and in time. And so in what would have been the original North American, almost like a Serengeti, right? We had coyotes and wolves and all sorts of different carnivores living together. But even at the time of colonization, there were abundant wolves and abundant coyotes. And so what you see is, of course, if wolves are taking down big prey, they're leaving food for scavengers. And so we had both. So there are places where, depending on if you have a multi-prey ecosystem, so you've got maybe elk and deer and antelope and bison and that, which would have been on the prairies, we had a situation where we would have a lot of wolves and coyotes living together. But they would, of course, vie off, right? And coyotes would be the loser in anything like that. Typically, wolves aren't hunting coyotes, but if coyotes are perceived to be taking their food, they would attack and kill them if they could. And so, yeah, but I think the key is that they're called what's called a mesocarnivore, and so they are able to live because they have very plastic diet. They are able to live in the cities, and they're able to live in the fringes among people, whereas wolves tend not to be able to do that as well. At least our gray wolves in the West here, they tend mostly to occur in big, more wild areas, and they might come out into an area that's populated by people, but they're going to get killed. And so they tend more to live in those areas. Coyotes, of course, are facing more persecution because they don't have any protection relative to wolves have a little more protection. In Canada, in the States, of course, you have endangered species legislation as well, but we don't have that on wolves here. But coyotes are still classified as vermin everywhere. And so they don't have protection. So in cities, they're dying on roads, and they're shot regularly outside of cities, and they're killed indiscriminately. So they have a lot more challenges to face. But you're right. They in the city, though, of course, they would be the top predator usually. We're starting to see more bobcats in our cities, though.
Cool.
And of course, some cities in the United States, you've got cougar as well coming into fringes, and so
cool.
They'd be interacting with those. But yeah, they are not a top carnivore when you get outside of the city. But I would say the biggest real predator for them is people. It's not. They would find their way and balance out in a system that didn't have people in it.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the misconceptions people have about coyotes?
Well, I think the biggest one from a management standpoint is that this idea that you have to top-down control them, so that if you don't kill them, they're just going to keep breeding out of control and overpopulate. And we know that's just not true. The science is very clear on that they will self-regulate based on the food that's available out there for them. Now, of course, that becomes an issue, and if you're providing them with food, then you're going to artificially supplement their numbers, right? And that's why we don't want to have that happen. But left to their own, they will regulate themselves. So there's still a hangover to this, what's called the North American model for wildlife management, which prescribes that you must top-down kill carnivores, and it's simply it was a time-specific thing that worked when ungulate populations had been decimated by people in the 1800s, and that in that model where there were very few ungulates left, and we were in a crisis. Killing the carnivores, of course, allowed them to pop back up, but we're not in that situation anymore. Plus, sentiments have changed and knowledge has changed. And so I think that's the biggest one is they will regulate themselves. We don't need to be out there shooting them. And there's lots of evidence, even in the interviews that I did with the agricultural sector, people have lived with the same packs of coyotes for multiple generations. Like the same family units keep reproducing, and so the same family of people will be on the land for 4 generations, and the coyotes are still using the same dens, and they've not been killing those coyotes, and they've had multiple generations of coyotes living there without problems happening. And then you have places where people are killing regularly, and they constantly have problems because they're not keeping the good ones in the landscape. So, it's there's some misguided ideas about how we have to manage these animals. And then this idea, I guess, that they're after our pets or whatever. They just mistake. They mistake. They're always hungry. They're always moving. They're always looking for their next meal. Sometimes some points in time, it's more important than others, like breeding season. And they will take whatever's easy, but it's not sometimes there's a sentiment that I've, read where people, feel that.
Dog.
Can you hear her?
Yeah.
Can you hear her?
Yeah,
She's
funny.
getting upset that I'm talking too much.
Yeah. I'm glad my cat's sleeping, because my cat can really go at it sometimes too.
Yeah, and this one is climbing up because she wants to be on the camel. Little rat.
Funny.
So, anyway, so I would say that's probably the biggest one. And not really understanding behavior. And we can use our dogs as ways to understand wild canid behavior, but I have seen that as well. There's lots of people that understand coyotes well, but then there are people that will mistake or mislabel things, or feel that aggression maybe isn't an appropriate behavior, and they forget that aggression is just something that coyotes do. Maybe they're protecting their den site, so it's not bad behavior. It's the right behavior, right, to protect their young. But if you're going in a den site and you get attacked because you've gone in a den site, you're usually going to get a lot of warning before something like that happens. But there's sort of misperception about why they would be, that kind of behavior is targeted towards people, as opposed to it's just what they would do with any foreign animal coming into a den site. But also things like if a coyote runs away and stops and looks at them, some people view that as aggressive. They think the coyote is stopped because it's sizing them up to decide whether it should eat them. When really what it's doing is it's put enough distance, just like deer, right, will flight to a certain distance, and then they stop and they look and they go, okay, am I safe? And if that person has a gun, they're going to keep doing their little ricochet thing till they're as far away as they can be. Or following you. Often being followed is out of curiosity, or out of trying to push you out of an important area. Now, that doesn't mean that they never follow you. If they are following you, it's probably because they either are mistaking you for someone that feeds them, or they're sizing up whether your little dog that's running off leash is is protected enough, right? So it's not to say they never do that. They do. But on average, it's curiosity that's driving their curiosity, or territorial defense that's driving them, pushing you out of an area.
So it sounds like two factors there are people in our culture having lost awareness and understanding of nature. They've lost the knowledge of animals and knowing how intelligent they are and being able to read them. So if people could read horses and dogs and coyotes better, and knew that they were actually intelligent and not stupid, then we wouldn't have some of these problems.
I think a lot of it comes down to, just understanding and compassion and trying, because that knowledge will help deal with the fear, right, related to the encounters. And the fear will often drive the negative encounter. But yes, I think we've even lost connection to the fact that we can look at our own dogs and look at the behavior of our dogs, and we can reinterpret coyote behavior through that lens, right? We tend, even though they're domestic, there's still certain behaviors reinforcement of, how quickly we can create bad behavior in our animals, in our dogs. We can do the same thing with coyotes, and then we need to maintain help them do the right thing. And so I think we often forget that connection between, we do that with our own domestic animals and have those expectations of ourselves, but we seem to toss that out when we start thinking about wildlife.
Mm-hmm. How often do coyotes really attack dogs and cats? How does that differ with what people think or how it might be reported?
Well, one of the things is it's difficult to get a handle on the actual number of attacks on pets and that. Of course they do. Now, the diet work that we did in the city of Calgary, there was only 1% of the 500 scats, just over 1% of the 500 scats. So that's the poop that you collect to look at the diet contents. Only about 3 of those 500, something like that, scats had pet remains in it. So it was fairly low as a proportional part of the diet. So there are other animals, though. A coyote is usually the one we go to when a cat disappears. We usually say it was a coyote. But there are foxes, and there are owls and eagles, and cars. So there are many other ways, and they might get scavenged. So, but definitely cats are much more vulnerable, and if you have little dogs running off leash, they're vulnerable. So, I think it's not getting to the number is difficult in terms of saying how frequently. I wouldn't say it's frequent because, otherwise we would have people always up in arms, and it's not. There's usually specific times of year where you might get a couple of pulses of that happening.
And they'd actually see it instead of just claiming it without picture or evidence.
Well, they might scavenge a dead cat too, right? So, but they do eat them. So it's not to say, but the bigger issue there, I think, is people not realizing that free roaming cats are actually a big issue, and they are having a major impact on songbird and migratory bird populations across North America. They're having a major effect in causing, some species to be near the brink of extinction, right? Mm-hmm. Because we don't think about, they're out there just catching a few birds or whatever. The free roaming cats can do a lot of damage. But in terms of so really what we can learn about encounters with pets is, free roaming animals, obviously, as soon as they're outside of your home, they're in the ecosystem. So any animal can take them, and or humans can take them. And then it's which animals are more vulnerable. Of course, small pets are more vulnerable than larger pets. Coyotes tend not to be chasing down big dogs to eat them. The research that I did shows that it's mostly territorial invasion when a coyote attacks a larger or medium-sized dog.
What do you mean by that? Territorial invasion?
The dog has run into some important territory of the coyote, and then it's gotten too close to coyote resources like food, and then the dog gets attacked defensively, and you can usually tell that by where the bite patternings are happening. It's on the head or the side, or grabbing a back end, as opposed to just eviscerating the dog. And people have this misnomer that the coyote lured our dog in there and it wanted to eat it, and it's like, well, the deal is, if coyotes want to eat your dog, they are going to do it, right? Especially if there's a pack. There's just not going to be. There's majority of the time they're going to be too fast, too strong, and they're going to do, if that's what they want to do, they're going to take it down. If they can take down a deer, they're going to take down your dog. So a lot of those are territorial defense. And then where those things happen or how they happen, the 97% of the cases that I looked at, these were media reported cases, in Canada, were dogs running off leash. So it's not like they were, you had to keep reading through the articles to find out, and later the person would say, yeah, well, my dog ran into the bush, right? So then in terms of people, the average in the United States and Canada is very similar. And that's, in Canada, over about a 12-year period. So from 1998 to 2000, I think it was 10. I might get the date range wrong there, but there were on average 3 people bitten or scratched by coyotes every year. So 3 people per year across Canada. The United States is 3 or 4. And for comparison, there are like 500,000 to 1 million dog bites to people.
But are people up in arms about dogs? Kill the dogs! Get rid of them!
In North America. And then in Canada, I'd like to use this comparison because people get immediately, if somebody's bitten, people start to call for coyotes to be killed. That 200 people a year are struck by lightning. So in terms of things that you can control that are environmental, you can actually control your encounters with coyotes. You can somewhat moderate your encounter with the lightning, but just in terms of random effects, there's a lot higher probability you're going to lot higher probability you're going to get struck by lightning than bitten by a coyote.
Or bit by a person, probably.
Probably a lot higher possibility of that, yeah.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot of that, more than people realize or stop to think about.
I don't know anything about that, but anyway,
yeah. I don't think I guess when I was a kid I knew about that, but I don't know about experience nowadays. But so mostly it's smaller dogs or dogs that are off leash where there's going to be a problem.
Leashing your animals is the best way to ensure you're not going to get in an altercation, or having extremely good recall and not having your dogs run off chasing coyotes, right? And then small dogs, the evidence is that even if a small dog's been grabbed by a coyote, unless it's immediately prey shake, like where they break the neck or something, in the cases that I saw, about half the time, if the person ran out and started yelling at the coyote would drop the dog and the dog survived. So human presence is actually important. I would say, though, with small dogs, it's really important to keep them on a leash. If you're in areas that are frequented by coyotes, why risk your pet? And I think when you think about it, you wouldn't let your dog free run down the middle of a highway or even on a residential street. For the most part, you'd be worried about them getting hurt. But there seems to be a disconnect there. And as soon as we get into a green space, we think, well, that should be where we're allowed to run the dogs free. And yes, there are green spaces we should be allowed to, but there are many factors there that can result in injury of a dog too. So you have to be conscious of that and, take the steps to ensure your animal's safe, right?
Yeah, right. They could get attacked by another dog.
Well, yeah, that also happens. So.
Yeah. And then I wonder, dogs are going to be different than wild animals just by nature, the way they move around and stuff. But in some cases, I wonder it might be a little better if some of the animals got out a little bit more. Then they might not necessarily want to run around like a little kid being freed for the first time in that case. Naturally going to be some curiosity, and they are going to move around some, but maybe just a little bit less. But what do coyotes eat mostly?
Mostly small mammals.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where you go, it's mostly small mammals like mice and ground squirrels and gophers or whatever.
Yeah, and it seems between the contest between thinking about getting a mice or a mouse or rat or squirrel, seems like it'd be a lot easier and a lot less risky for the coyote than going after a dog or cat. Seems like more potential for injury from a dog or a cat than from a mouse or a squirrel. Or are they actually good fighters? Are they better than I know?
Well, I think it's more, you have to think about it in terms of energetic output, right? How much effort is it going to take to take down that prey versus what are you getting back? And something like a ground squirrel is a really good return on investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of calories.
Yeah. And then even a deer, it seems like it's going to offer a lot less fight than similar sized dog. So it does show, as you say, they could take down a bigger dog, but then there's also that.
They don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not their preference, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So what are some steps people can take to have a good relationship with coyotes and allow them to be around but not have some of these problems?
Yeah, I think that's sort of a good place to probably close off for people, is to give some basic, ow! My foot just got bitten. Somebody's getting agitated. There are websites where there's lots of different websites you can search. Obviously, Project Coyote has some really good educational material. That's for the United States, and have programs for communities that can help them with these strategies. And in Canada, we have Coyote Watch Canada, who also does a lot of education, outreach, and coexistence work. So all of those sites will have some good information on and available information on what to do. Essentially, I would say the first thing is you just become aware that they're out there and what kinds of habitats they're in. And if you have dogs and that you're walking regularly, people who have dogs will usually know, like they will know somebody who's had an encounter and sort of seen coyotes around. And so it's becoming aware of where do they live and what are their types of activity patterns. And then, when you're in those areas, keeping the dog on leash or keeping it very close. And if you don't have recall, then you need to keep it on a leash if you know there's coyotes around or potentially any coyotes around. And then there are the first step, of course, is never to get them cornered. Like, always allow them to have that space to move away from you. So you have to think about that in terms of if it's up against a wall or a bunch of trees and it perceives it can't move, then it's more likely to try to defend itself. And so you give them the space to move through. Sometimes coyotes will escort you or come up close to you, or they're coming up to challenge you or that because they've been habituated. And so in those cases, you don't ever want to run away. You want to, if you have small kids with you, bring the small children either into your arms or next to you. And then pets, of course, get them immediately on a leash if they're not, and close to you as well. And if the coyote, and you can, you don't want to run away, you want to just move yourself away. If the coyote is following you or persisting, then you can turn around and you can yell at it or throw your arms up in the air and you look big. Mm-hmm. If you happen to not, if it happens to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, it's a little hard to know the difference between whether it's trying to get you out of there or it's interested in your pet. So, so the best thing is to just continue to move away. They will generally stop at some point. You don't want to turn away and lose contact with the animal, right? So you just want to keep moving until you're out of there. And keep backing away. If they're persisting and it's becoming, and they have a way to get out and it's becoming unnerving, you can pick up something and throw it at them like a rock or that. But the other thing you can do is some people will do things like just carry a foreign object with them when they walk, like maybe it's a walking stick or an umbrella or something like that, or you have a plastic bag. Anything that coyotes aren't typically used to. If you use that within your yelling, they will generally take off. So it's a matter of keeping a sane head and assessing the situation. And then if they're escalating somehow, then you get bigger and get yourself away as quickly as you can and give them the space to move away as quickly as you can. This type of thing is not happening all the time, right? This is these are the exception rather than the rule. And generally what happens is you get one or two coyotes that become habituated. And so the neighborhoods where where that kind of thing is happening on average. So if you educate yourself to that and basic behavior and basic ecology of where they might live, that's probably the best. It's vigilance, right? It's just knowing your environment. And we do the same thing with bears. We learn how to be in bear habitat when we're hiking. It's the same thing. You want to just learn the basic rules of engagement. Should, the isolated case happen to you, the majority of coyotes are just going to move on their way.
Mm-hmm. Cool. then as you say, don't feed them. Don't leave out food.
Yeah.
Try to control that.
Yeah, that is a key thing. Manage it from the perspective of your yards or neighborhoods. You want to make sure garbage is secure. You want to not plant trees that have fruit on them that are going to bring them in, or clean it up, and not leave out dog food or bird seed and that they will eat. So those are called attractants. So it's managing attractants is the other big part of that. And knowing that when coyote problems occur, it's usually there's somebody in the neighborhood is breaking those rules essentially, right? And maybe not knowing they're doing it, but it creates issues for everybody else. And so communities need to start to talk amongst themselves and be aware of what's going on in the neighborhood, right?
And just the same basic principle is trying to not attract rats or mice or criminals,
Precisely.
So, cool. Any last words for folks?
No, I think that's it.
Cool.
We've covered a lot.
Yeah, it was fun. Cool. But all right, cool. So hope you enjoyed that, folks. And thanks. Should we call you Dr. Alexander or Shelley? Okay.
You can call me Shelley.
I should have asked at the beginning.
And
I didn't think about
if
that.
anyone wants to, they can find me on the internet. Or they can find me at the University of Calgary. And I also have a research website at the University of Calgary too. It's the Canid Lab. Canid Conservation Science Lab, so they can find me that way. And if anybody's looking for publications, they're listed there, or you can either search Google Scholar, or you can contact me.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, the link. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, wait. Okay, I saw your dog, so hold on. Sorry I woke you up. Sorry,
oh my
kitty.
gosh.
My kitty.
Oh. Kitty! Yeah, the sound engineer.
He just woke up. Sorry, kitty.
Oh my gosh, he's huge.
Yeah.
What a cutie. Oh, the dogs are getting excited.
So, all right.
Hear the cat.
Cool. So,
thanks so much.
Thank you. So thanks. Hope you enjoyed it, folks, and thanks for listening. And we got links in the show notes for you, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye.